Imagine a man who, without a single university degree, without a computer, without laboratories equipped with modern technology, was able to design flying machines, tanks of war, solar energy collectors, functional robots, and detailed maps of the human heart. All of this more than 500 years ago. Imagine that this same man painted what would become the most famous work of art in human history. That he dissected human corpses in secret, in the dead of night, to understand how muscles move and how the heart pumps blood. That he wrote thousands of pages of notes in mirror writing, deliberately reversed, so that no one could easily read his thoughts. His name was Leonardo da Vinci, and to this day, historians, scientists, and philosophers struggle to find a single adequate explanation for how one human mind could contain so much and be so far beyond its own time. This is not a story of a painter who had some curious hobbies. This is the story of a man who may have been the greatest intellect ever born on this planet, and who died largely misunderstood. His greatest discoveries hidden in notebooks that the world would not fully read for centuries. What you are about to hear is not legend, it is history, and it is far more extraordinary than any legend could ever be.
The year is 1452. In the small Tuscan town of Vinci, nestled among rolling hills of olive trees and vineyards in the heart of Italy, a child is born under circumstances that, in that era, could have condemned him to a life of obscurity before it even began. His father, Ser Piero da Vinci, is a respected notary, a man of social standing, legal expertise, and carefully maintained reputation. His mother, Caterina, is a young peasant woman of modest origins. They are not married, and in the rigid social hierarchy of Renaissance Italy, that distinction carries enormous consequences. The child born from this union, Leonardo, is technically illegitimate. Under the laws and customs of the time, that means no right of inheritance, no access to formal Latin education, which was reserved for sons of legitimate households, no entry into the prestigious guilds of law, medicine, or the church. The door to the established intellectual world of the 15th century is, by birth, closed to him. And yet, looking back across 5 centuries, one cannot help but wonder whether this exclusion was, paradoxically, the greatest gift the universe could have given him. Because Leonardo, denied the rigid academic path, was forced to learn in the only way that would ever truly satisfy him, by looking, by watching, by questioning everything he saw with a relentless, almost unsettling intensity. As a boy growing up in the Tuscan countryside, he observed the flight of birds for hours, studying the precise angle of their wings, the mechanics of how they caught the wind. He watched water flow over stones in the river and noticed the patterns it made, patterns he would later recreate in detailed drawings of fluid dynamics. He studied the faces of people in the market, the movement of light on leaves, the geometry of shadows on stone walls. His father, recognizing that something unusual lived inside this boy, arranged for him to enter the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio in Florence, one of the most celebrated artists and craftsmen of the age. Florence in the 1460s was perhaps the most intellectually vibrant city in the Western world. The Medici family ruled as generous patrons of art and philosophy. The streets hummed with debate about ancient Greek texts, theology, painting, sculpture, and the nature of the cosmos. In Verrocchio's bottega, Leonardo learned to grind pigments, stretch canvas, sculpt bronze, and design architectural elements. He absorbed technique at a speed that astonished his master. But more telling than his technical skill was the quality of his observation.
When Verrocchio was commissioned to paint the Baptism of Christ, he assigned Leonardo the task of painting one of the angels, a secondary figure, a background detail. The angel Leonardo painted was so luminous, so alive, so technically superior to anything else in the composition, that Verrocchio reportedly set down his own brush and declared he would never paint again. His student had surpassed him. But even as Florence celebrated Leonardo as a rising artistic star, something deeper was already stirring beneath the surface of the paintings. His notebooks, which he had begun filling with extraordinary energy, were not the notebooks of an artist. They were the notebooks of something the world had never quite seen before. By his late 20s, Leonardo had already begun sketching designs for machines that would not be built for centuries. He recorded observations about geology that anticipated modern science by 300 years. He wrote about the circulation of blood with an intuition that would not be confirmed until William Harvey's formal discoveries in 1628, nearly 150 years after Leonardo had quietly noted it on a page no one was reading. He moved to Milan in 1482 at the age of 30, entering the court of Ludovico Sforza, the Duke of Milan. He did not write to introduce himself as a painter. He wrote as a military engineer, an architect, a canal builder, a designer of war machines. The letter he sent to Sforza is one of the most astonishing documents of the Renaissance, a list of 10 capabilities covering weapons of war, siege engines, bridge construction, underwater warfare, and architecture, with painting mentioned almost as an afterthought at the very end. He was not selling himself as an artist, he was selling himself as a mind. And in Milan, surrounded by the resources of a powerful court, with more time and more freedom than he had ever known, Leonardo began to truly unleash what was inside him. What emerged from those years would challenge and eventually shatter everything the world thought it knew about the limits of human intelligence.
There is something deeply unsettling about the notebooks of Leonardo da Vinci, not because of what is in them, but because of when they were written. More than 7,000 pages survive. Scholars estimate that as many as half of his original notes have been lost. What remains represents perhaps the most extraordinary private archive in the history of human thought, a vast, dense, obsessive record of one man's attempt to understand everything. He wrote in mirror script, from right to left, reversed, so that the text could only be read easily in a mirror's reflection. The reasons for this remain debated. Some historians suggest he simply found it more natural as he was left-handed. Others believe it was a deliberate act of concealment, protecting ideas too dangerous, too radical, or too far beyond the comprehension of his age to be shared openly. Whatever his reasons, the effect was the same. The full contents of Leonardo's mind remained largely inaccessible to the world for centuries after his death. And what a mind it was. In the years he spent in Milan and later in Florence and Rome, Leonardo designed a machine with rotating blades designed to lift a man into the air, a concept remarkably similar to what we would recognize today as a helicopter. He designed an armored vehicle, enclosed and powered by human occupants turning cranks, capable of moving across a battlefield while protecting the soldiers inside, a rudimentary tank sketched in 1487. He drew detailed plans for a glider, calculating wingspan and body weight ratios with a precision that aeronautical engineers would later find startlingly accurate. He designed a mechanical knight, an automaton capable of sitting, moving its arms and opening its jaw, operated by a series of pulleys and cables. When engineers at NASA reconstructed it from his original drawings in the 20th century, it worked. He proposed solar concentrators to heat water. He designed a rudimentary calculator. He mapped the course of rivers and proposed canal systems for the entire region of Lombardy.
He studied the movement of tectonic plates, though that concept would not formally exist in science for another 4 centuries, and correctly deduced that the mountains of Italy had once been the floor of an ancient sea. But perhaps the most extraordinary and the most dangerous of Leonardo's secret pursuits was his systematic dissection of human corpses. In the Florence and Milan of the late 15th century, the dissection of human bodies was a crime punishable by the Church. The human form was sacred, a vessel of the divine soul, and to cut it open for study was considered a profound desecration. The penalties were severe. Leonardo did it anyway. Working at night, in cold rooms, with a steady hand, he dissected more than 30 human bodies over the course of his lifetime. He mapped the musculature of the human body with an accuracy that would not be equaled by medical science for more than a century. He drew the chambers of the heart, the structure of the spine, the formation of the fetus in the womb, studies so precise that they are still used as anatomical references today. He observed the valves of the heart and correctly described how they opened and closed to regulate blood flow, a mechanism that would not be formally understood until the modern era. He studied the optic nerve and proposed a theory of how the eye processes light that anticipates the physics of vision. He did all of this alone, in secret, filling pages that almost no one would read for 500 years. And herein lies one of the most haunting aspects of Leonardo's story. He did not publish. He did not teach. He did not build institutions or train successors. His discoveries in medicine, engineering, geology, physics, botany, astronomy remained locked inside private notebooks, written backward, scattered across different cities, gradually dispersed after his death among collectors and noblemen who often did not even understand what they possessed. What would the world have looked like if Leonardo's notebooks had been published in 1520, if his designs had been built, if his anatomical discoveries had entered the mainstream of medical education? It is, of course, impossible to know, but the question is not merely academic. It touches something deeply human, the recognition that brilliance without the right circumstances, without the right audience, can vanish into the silence of history as though it never existed at all. Now, before we reach the final chapter of this extraordinary life, we want to hear from you. What strikes you most about what Leonardo achieved and what he left unfinished? Leave your thoughts in the comments. The conversation that follows may be as fascinating as the story itself.
By the time Leonardo da Vinci reached the final years of his life, he had outlived most of the world he had known. The Florence of the Medici, that extraordinary republic of art and philosophy that had shaped his youth, had transformed. Milan had fallen to French invasion. His greatest patrons were dead or in exile. The political map of Italy had been redrawn by war, and Leonardo, who had always navigated the courts of powerful men with remarkable skill, found himself increasingly adrift. In 1516, at the age of 64, he accepted an invitation from the young French king Francis I, a monarch with a deep and genuine passion for the Italian Renaissance. Leonardo traveled to France, crossing the Alps on horseback, bringing with him 3 paintings, his notebooks, and the restless mind that had never, not for a single day of his life, truly found peace. The king installed him in the Château du Clos-Luce, a small manor house connected by an underground tunnel to the royal residence at Amboise. He gave Leonardo the title of premier painter, architect, and engineer to the king. He gave him a generous pension, unlimited hospitality, and, perhaps most precious of all, freedom. And Leonardo, in the final years of his life, seems to have found something approaching contentment. He conversed with the king, he continued writing in his notebooks, he refined his paintings, including the Mona Lisa, which he had carried with him for years, continuing to rework it long after most artists would have declared it finished.
but his right hand had begun to fail him. A stroke, historians believe, had partially paralyzed it. The hand that had drawn 10,000 diagrams, dissected 30 human bodies, painted the Last Supper and the Vitruvian Man, that hand could no longer hold a brush with the steadiness it once had. He continued to write, he continued to think, he continued to be, even in physical decline, the most restless and searching intelligence of his age. On the 2nd of May, 1519, Leonardo da Vinci died at the Château du Clos-Luz. He was 67 years old. According to a later account, possibly embellished but deeply evocative, the king himself was holding Leonardo in his arms when he drew his final breath. He died far from his homeland, in the French countryside, in the arms of a foreign king who admired him more than any Italian patron had in his final decades. He left behind no children, no published works, and no formal scientific legacy. His notebooks, those 7,000 extraordinary pages, were dispersed across Europe, passing from hand to hand, often unread, sometimes damaged, gradually disappearing into private collections and royal libraries. It would take centuries for the world to begin to understand what Leonardo had actually done. The full scope of his anatomical drawings was not published until the 19th century. His engineering designs were rediscovered and rebuilt in the 20th century. His geological theories were recognized as precursors to modern Earth science. His studies of fluid dynamics were found to anticipate discoveries that would not formally emerge until the 19th and 20th centuries. In other words, Leonardo da Vinci was not simply a man ahead of his time. He was, in some measurable and documented sense, centuries ahead of his time. The civilization that surrounded him was not equipped to receive what he was offering, and so his greatest work, the work that was not art, but science, engineering, medicine, and philosophy, remained locked in silence, waiting for a world that could finally understand it. And yet, here is the paradox at the heart of Leonardo's story. The very qualities that made him so astonishing, the relentless curiosity, the compulsion to begin new projects before finishing old ones, the inability to be satisfied with any single discipline, also made him, in the conventional sense, profoundly incomplete. He left dozens of major works unfinished. He abandoned commissions. He lost interest in projects the moment the intellectual challenge was solved, regardless of whether the physical object had been completed. The Adoration of the Magi, begun in 1481, was never finished. The colossal bronze horse he designed for Milan, which would have been the largest equestrian statue in history, was never cast. The notebooks themselves were never organized, never published, never transmitted to a student or successor. Was this a tragedy, or was it simply the inevitable consequence of a mind that moved faster than any single lifetime could contain? Perhaps both things are true. Perhaps that is what makes Leonardo da Vinci not merely a historical figure, but a mirror, a reflection of the highest possibilities of the human mind and of the terrible loneliness that sometimes accompanies the rare individual who is capable of seeing what others cannot yet imagine. He was born the illegitimate son of a notary in a small Tuscan town. He died in the arms of a French king, holding paintings he had never finished and notebooks the world had not yet learned to read. In between, he designed the future. And 500 years later, with our helicopters and our anatomical scans and our hydraulic machines and our solar panels, we are still, in some ways, only now beginning to catch up.
There are very few figures in the entire history of recorded civilization about whom it can be said, without exaggeration, that they existed on a different intellectual plane from the world around them. Leonardo da Vinci is one of those figures, perhaps the greatest of them all. His story is not simply the story of a talented painter. It is the story of what happens when a human mind, freed from the constraints of convention by accident of birth, given just enough access to the resources of a sophisticated civilization, and driven by a curiosity that knows no boundary. What happens when such a mind is turned loose on the world? The result, as history records, was 5 centuries of ideas that the world was not yet ready for. We are deeply grateful that you stayed with us through this journey, from the olive groves of Vinci to the quiet manor house beside the Loire River, where one of history's greatest minds drew its last breath. Staying until the very end of a story like this one takes a kind of patience and curiosity that Leonardo himself would have recognized and admired. And we want you to know, the best is still to come. The next story waiting for you on this channel is every bit as extraordinary. Another life, another era, another chapter of history that changed everything. Do not miss it. If this story moved you, challenged you, or left you with questions you have never considered before, share it. Leave your thoughts below. Subscribe so that history's most remarkable stories find their way to you. Because the past, as Leonardo proved beyond any doubt, has a great deal left to teach us.